behalf of the Planning Committee, welcome to the third class of our 7-class course on the Variety Pack. And I'm Joanne Bundy. I chair the Community Education Council, which brings you the bucket courses. Please check your cell phones at this time to make sure they're silenced. And if you have hearing aids that accommodate T-coil, you can turn those on as well. We have a gorgeous quilt up here this morning, which you will hear about after the break. So if you're curious why, you'll find out about it then. Just a couple of announcements. You have a little handout that Eric McIntyre gave you this morning for the upcoming concert this Saturday. One other thing is that Caleb Elfenbein, who was our speaker last week, will be here tomorrow evening in this room, 7 o'clock, and he will be hosting a talk on 100 Years of Change, World War I to the contemporary Middle East. So it sounds like a very good program. That's here tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. And now we come to Sherman. Jim Ahrens, in addition to being our registrar, is also our military historian. He is professor of history emeritus from Wentworth College, Wentworth Military Academy and Junior College, right? And he is going to tell us about Sherman's March to the Sea and all about William Tecumseh Sherman. I bet you think you know a lot about Sherman, but I'll bet that you're going to find out a lot today that you didn't know at all. So please welcome Jim Ahrens.
Thank you. Okay, how do you hear me in the back, George? Okay.
I can hear anybody.
They had to drop the lights there. There we go. Okay. Well, I've gotten interested in Sherman when I was in graduate school. In fact, in one class, I was the guy who argued Sherman in the debates that they held in that course. So I've done a lot of this stuff over a lot of different years. And there's quite a number of books on Sherman. And I'm going to show you the 2 slides with all these bibliographies. Most of those books I own and have picked up over the years. And if anybody wants that bibliography, I can extract that and email it to you. Make sure I've got your email address if you're interested in all that. But there's been a lot written about him, and I would hazard to guess that there are 2 guys that are probably the most famous coming out of the Civil War, with the third one. And the first one, of course, is US Grant. The second one is Sherman, and the third one is Phil Sheridan. So we'll go ahead and talk about the background of Sherman. His background, of course, is English, and we can trace that to an Edmund Sherman in Essex in the 16th century. And 2 sons of his turned up in Massachusetts and later in Connecticut. And Sherman, the general, is descended from a cousin of theirs, a Roger Sherman, who, if you know your early American history, you'll see his name written on the Declaration of Independence. One of his sons, or one of his cousins, excuse me, was a grandfather, and the grandfather was named Taylor Sherman. And he was a land commissioner in the Western Reserve. And that was a territory that was reserved for Revolutionary War veterans. It was like a way of paying them a bonus in land in northern part of Ohio. Case Western Reserve University, you've probably heard of. That's in that same territory there. His son, Charles Roberts, and that's not a really good picture of him, it's a painting. But you'd be surprised at how rare photographs are from the 18th century. Charles Roberts and his wife, Mary Hoyt, settled in Lancaster, Ohio, and he participated in the War of 1812. And during that time, he came to admire the Indian chief of the, let's see, what was it, the tribe, not the Iroquois, no. Oh, let's see. Oh, it'll come to me eventually here. And anyway, he was a very charismatic Shawnee chief. And that's when they lived in that same territory. And he was a man who was well listened to by the Native Americans. And he tried to foment a rebellion against the people who were settling in that area from the East Coast. He died during the War of 1812, the Battle of Thames. And there were all kinds of songs made about that particular one, including one about the fellow who became vice president of the United States, and he was given credit for having killed Tecumseh during the battle at the Thames River just over the border of Canada. Interestingly enough, he was a fellow for whom Johnson County was named, which is the next one south of where we lived down in Missouri for almost 30 years. Anyway, Charles Robert was admired for his integrity and his honesty, and he was appointed a judge for the Ohio Supreme Court. That took a good deal of circuit riding, and in some of those problems they had with economics for years, he had lost some public money, and he was determined to repay the debt. So he had very few resources against that when he died on the circuit that he was riding in 1829. Tecumseh and 5 other children were put out for adoption by, first of all, to Thomas Ewing, who was a very successful lawyer, businessman, and eventually, and through his political connections, became the first Secretary of the Interior. So he was the guy who was a next-door neighbor of Mrs. Sherman, and so they put the Sherman Tecumseh out for adoption, and Ewing chose him. Now, there were some other brothers. Charles Taylor Sherman, who eventually became a federal judge. Hoyt Sherman became a very successful businessman, and he was in the first CEO of Equitable Life in Des Moines, Iowa. And his home is Hoyt Sherman Place, and it's now an auditorium, and I think it's the home of the Des Moines Symphony, as I recall. But anyway, the next brother, John Sherman, and I'm told no relation to the John Sherman yet here, but he was well known through the 19th century. He was first a U.S. representative, and then he was a senator, and he spent over 40 years in D.C. And the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act, something which pops up in the news even yet today, were some of his products. And he was a close correspondent with the general. Foster brothers, General Hugh Boyle Ewing and Thomas Ewing Jr. were both generals in the Civil War. You find that these people are all over the history of 19th century America. And they were a very famous group of people. Kump was what they called Sherman. And There's a mythic tale that he was baptized by a Catholic priest at the behest of his very religious stepmother. And she insisted that he had to have a saint's name first. And the story became almost mythic, but it wasn't true. It was proven later not to be true because he'd already been baptized by a circuit-riding Presbyterian minister as William Tecumseh Sherman. But the family called him Cump all his life. And he was rather uncomfortable in his situation, and this was recognized by Thomas Ewing, and he insisted that the boy would grow up knowing the value of work and know all about his own family background, even though he was living in a rich household. And interestingly enough, Sherman would sign all of his signatures, even letters to his wife, with that. He lived in a family in which Thomas Ewing was often gone for much of the year in Washington, D.C., and they looked after his affairs as well they could at home. But he had presents sent to them, 3 boys and 1 girl, as well as to his foster child, Cump, and his foster sister. And Cump became so close that eventually Ellen would marry William. The schools in Lancaster were quite good. There he learned French, Latin, some Greek. He was constantly reading because his foster father had an enormous library, well stocked. And he was good in math, and he helped Ellen with hers, and she came to look upon him as her protector. The children all had plenty to do, and they benefited from this and all those usual childhood delights that you find in small towns like Lancaster, Missouri, Ohio, and Grinnell, Iowa. On the more serious side, the family had to participate in a very strong Catholic religious life. Thomas Ewing Sr. practiced no religion whatsoever, but his wife more than made up for it. And the boys all resisted this religious instruction, and Ellen took it very seriously as her mother did. And it would tend to lead to endless struggle and conflict in their long married life. He also felt he was different from the rest, and he felt the loss of a father, and this was a cause of disorder in his life. Ewing noticed that shyness and gave him considerable attention so that he would develop as well as possible. And he began to think of a military career when he saw the militia being called up in an Indian uprising. It caught his attention, and he thought, oh, he might well fit into this kind of thing. Ewing Sr. probably didn't plant the seed, but nobody knows. But he certainly didn't discourage it, because he wrote to the Secretary of War when Cump was 15 and got him an appointment to West Point in 1836. The boy had devoted his last year before going off to West Point to an intensive study of French and math, and he had worked as a surveyor on a surveying team, earning his first money. And when he departed by stagecoach, eventually railroad cars, ferry boats, he finally reached West Point in the summer of June 1836 and began a military career that lasted till 1884, with an 8-year break from 1853 to 61. In 1836, at West Point, was in the era after Sylvanus Thayer, the longtime superintendent who really organized as a system. Dennis Hart Mahon was the chief academic force in the school, who passed on a lot of what the lessons the French military historian Antoine Henri Chaumeny had distilled from the Napoleonic Wars. A great deal of French influence in the American Army. Their ideas of offensive and employment of tactics ruled the West Point instruction. Of those people who would fight the Mexican Wars and the Civil War. They also received a heavy diet of military engineering, and it could be applied to civilian projects. And it was no accident that almost all of the railroads and canals that were built before the Civil War were engineered by West Point grads. It was really about the only source of engineers, and as such it was a national treasure. The conditions there were Spartan, to say, put it mildly. The schedule was impossible, discipline was severe, and Kump was a good student. He had no problem with the academics, but he was rebellious in the disciplinary sense, and he tended to push the rules as much as possible. And he was well known for his late night visits to a local tavern, which he brought back food from to pass on to the other comrades in the same barracks. Rations were Spartan too. And his class standing suffered some, but his feelings of belonging and comradely affection, though, grew stronger and stronger. This was home, and it brought order to his life, and he would never lose that feeling. Well, just a little aside on this. Yet today, men and women fight in units, not for abstract ideas, but for the approval of their fellows and the sense of belonging. The leadership principles that I used to have on the wall of my classroom from a reading that we had was 1, know your stuff, 2, be a person of integrity, and 3, take care of your people. Those 3 aspects of military life help and have helped throughout history in successful military units. Kump would feel the feelings of unity just as long as he lived and associated with military personnel and veterans. And it was perhaps best expressed by Lieutenant General Hal Moore on a TV program I recorded at one time to use in class about his unit, which was the 7th Cavalry. You've heard of that in other connections. In the Nha Trang Valley in Vietnam. And Moore said, and reiterated it in speeches to graduates at the academy, that people who go to war together are brothers for life. And throughout the West Point career, he was a constant correspondent with Ellen. And when he graduated in June 1840 with a commission in the artillery, he had been docked by his class standing. Otherwise, he'd have gone into the elite corps of engineers, the people you hear about today, the ones who manage all the rivers and waterways here in the States. His first duty assignment was the 3rd Artillery Regiment, which was deployed to Florida in the midst of a long and dirty counterinsurgency against the Seminole Indians. And it had lessons for the Army for such future conflicts like the Philippine insurrection, the bandit chasing expeditions in Mexico and Central America, as well as in Vietnam. And we could add in, I think we could draw some lessons from the American conquest of Iraq. That's another subject for another time. Sherman survived all of that. And he was posted to many different places in the South, and everywhere he went, he was a close observer of both people and territory, and he soaked up this knowledge. He would associate with fellow West Pointers and persons he met during his early career, and corresponded with some of them for the rest of his life. His correspondence over a lifetime was huge, and it's ready to hand, and much of it is being transcribed into digital form that is quite accessible to people who, like me, were looking for paper material for in graduate school and so forth. He was when the Seminole War ended in 1842. It had been a cost of 1,500 lives, to mostly disease and battle somewhat, and $40 million in those days to move the Seminole Indians down the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. And Jackson's goal was that much closer to being fulfilled, of eliminating the Southeast Indian competition for white settlers. Combs' unit posted near Pensacola and also in Charleston gave him a chance to associate with youthful society by himself now. He had a certain disdain during that time for politicians and the politics of the country. And yet he admired Thomas Ewing because he owed the man a debt for taking him in under his wing. He didn't adopt the Whig Party's whole program, but he did adopt the feeling of nationalism. And he believed that the principle of nullification, in which the state could say, no, you can't enforce this law within our borders, was wrong. He also believed in the South's doctrine that slavery was part of the natural order of things, and that he was unconvinced that blacks could ever be the equal of whites. And he disdained many Northern and British abolitionists as nothing but troublemakers. You can't ignore the belief that he had, but generally he believed that union was paramount and it had to be maintained. And the Army and unit cohesion of the West Pointers were the philosophic bases of his life. This is Sherman as a young man. And you can see by the shoulder boards, he was a second lieutenant as he had joined the ranks of the 3rd Artillery. Well, he missed most of the combat phase of the 1846-47 Mexican-American War. He was assigned as a recruiting official, and later he was in a unit sent to California. And in that trip, he endured something like 198 days on sailing vessels, as you can see, following the route all the way around the nasty weather at Cape Horn and then on up to the west coast there. That's roughly, that's over 6 months. Anyway, that unit was assigned to augment any people who had been in Kearny's expedition and Fremont's expedition to take California away from the Mexicans. And there were 5 officers, all West Points, in that unit. Henry Halleck and Ed Ord were probably the best known individuals out of that. When they reached California, they found out that there was really no need for them there now at that time. And so the place was definitely under control of the American Army, as you can see from that drawing there. Now, I might remark here at this point, there are very few photographs that were taken of military operations before the Mexican War, but there were some. But most of the time, the first war in history that was well photographed was the British-French expedition against the Russians, called the Crimean War in 1856. And there was also a few photographs published by people who had taken them during the Mexican War, mostly of dusty-looking soldiers. Excuse me. But Sherman found that the California culture of old California, and for those people who are native Californians, I have been told that it was quite distinctive from both Mexican and from Spanish culture. There were other people who were served out there in that area. US Grant did. He served in the Pacific Northwest, and he became so disillusioned that he turned to alcohol and eventually resigned from the service, and before he got into serious trouble. But Sherman, while he was there, became an aide to the military governor of California. And there were many lessons here that he learned and profited by it later when he was military governor of Memphis for a time during the Civil War. He was very familiar, having traveled all over the countryside, and he stored up all of this knowledge as he could. But in 1848, Jacob Sutter brought an ore sample to the American governor, and it proved to be gold. And Sherman was one of the first to know what it was. And that was the beginning of the famous gold rush. And it would turn the country upside down, not only California, but the rest of the country. Everybody had fever for gold. And the world went bananas. One good effect was that it became a source of capital. New capital required for development. And that infusion of it made possible much of the development in the first industrial revolution in the United States. But people were out there looking for it. It was an odd photograph. I had a hard time getting some of these photographs to transfer to slides because they had not a lot of quality to the photographs that would stand to being blown up. So they turned out to be grainy or strain the pixels in the program. But people went out, and that was the big way of doing it, was panning it. Either that or using sluice boxes where water was running through constantly to work it off. And in the early days of that gold rush, a lot of it got mined out. Well, the Mexican War was over. Peace meant that the Army had no need of military government, and pretty soon all kinds of other people flocked to the gold field. Merchants, ladies of the night, all sorts of others came by whatever transportation they could find to get across this country. And for Sherman, the biggest impact, of course, in the gold rush was the inflation that resulted in the boomtown atmosphere in California. And he acquired some, while he was on during Lee's time, he acquired some property in San Francisco. And in January of 1849, he went back home, went back to the east. and saw his betrothed for the first time in 4 years. And he would marry his stepsister in a Catholic ceremony attended by President Zachary Taylor, his whole cabinet, the Supreme Court, and a host of military and political acquaintances of both Kumpf and the Senator Tom Ewing, and who's now a Secretary of the Interior. Kumpf and his wife were 30 and 26, respectively. They tried to work out their differences in religion and other matters before marrying, and these would remain throughout their married life. She wanted him to quit the Army and settle into a civilian occupation in the vicinity of Lancaster, Ohio, and to be a good Catholic working among some enterprise that was owned by Thomas Ewing, looking after his estates. Where Kumpf regarded the Army as his extended family, but they were both devoted to each other, and would remain so during their long and sometimes tempestuous marriage. And subsequent to marriage and honeymoon, Sherman and Ellen, who is now pregnant with their first child, were stationed in St. Louis with the Commissary Corps. And they would continue their conflict over where the Army would send them, and Ellen and their new daughters would remain much of the time in Lancaster, Ohio. Now, Sherman will resign in 1853, mostly at her behest, but also the fact that there were lots of pressures in the economy to do so. And he settled into a job at the San Francisco bank that was owned by a couple of friends from St. Louis. And he was pretty successful. His family joined him, but economic panics and a lack of civic order during the vigilante period caused him a great deal of stress. And a lot of that was manifested in depression and stress-induced asthma. We kept trying to find order in a disordered California. I'm sure there are people today who would say the same thing goes on out there. During the panic of 1857, both San Francisco and New York branches of the same bank failed, as well as the St. Louis office. And in the aftermath of this, the pro-slavery people, who were great supporters of this, had opportunity to crow about how the free market economics of the North endangered them and how stable the slaveocracy really was. And Sherman was without employment. He turned briefly to lawyering in Kansas with two of his foster brothers, Tom Jr. and Hugh Boyle. They were basically looking after Thomas Sr.'s investments. And much to his disgust, Kumpf was admitted to the Kansas bar on quote-unquote general intelligence. And he figured out that from experience that whomever sounded most as if he knew what he was talking about usually won the case. Actually, Sherman worked at whatever he could in order to earn money to bring his family to join him. And he had heard through corresponding with Army friends that there was an opening for a superintendent in a military academy in Louisiana. And that's where he applied. And he was hired in August of 1859. And he reported 1 January 1860 and took over a job that was just a natural for him. His job was to run the place, get it built, get it manned, equipped, and he would teach engineering and military subjects. Eventually that becomes Louisiana State University. but it was a job for which he was absolutely qualified. And he was able to carry out the task in the midst of a very contentious election. He knew that the abolitionists had won the succession argument, and it was a probability. But he wouldn't make any moves to desert the Union. And he wouldn't appear to even do so. And he was such a nationalist that he refused to take custody of firearms that the seceding state of Louisiana had taken and wanted to store in that state building. He wouldn't do it, and so he resigned. And after they followed, the rest of the states followed the election of Lincoln with secession. Sherman went north. He went to meet with his brother John, and they went to visit Lincoln personally. And he wasn't impressed at all with the kind of devil-may-care attitude by Lincoln and the other politicians in March of 1861. There was great pressure to reinforce the Fort Sumter that was become a battle place in April. Kump had to do something, though, for a job. So he went to St. Louis and took over running a street railway company. It's kind of like the kind that streetcars run on tracks pulled by horses before the electrification of such things. And he ran that for a while. He applied for a position in a regular unit, and he was retained his West Pointers disdain for volunteers. In early June 1861, Kump received a call to report to the D.C. area, and he was to command a newly authorized regular unit. And he was speedily seconded to the Inspector General, who assigned him to evaluate military defenses in Washington. He had acquired a reputation as being a very astute observer, having worked for the IG previous to his resignation, and he was much in demand. But then after that, he was rewarded with giving command of a brigade in a division by Irwin McDowell's people. And that leads us to the first Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861. Now, I'm not going to give you much of anything in the way of this explanation of tactics, strategy, and so forth. It's not germane here, and you probably have little interest in such things. Just remember, the Army traditionally uses blue for its colors and red for the enemy's colors. So you can see what the orientation was in this. The first Battle of Bull Run was a disaster. In fact, most of the politicians in Washington figured that it was going to be a rout, that all of those folks would run back to where they'd come from when the sight of the Union Army came onto the field. Well, how wrong they were. They had a plan that was extremely complicated, and it stood against people. There was a fellow whose unit right here, Thomas J. Jackson, who became known as Stonewall Jackson, standing like a stone wall against the Union attack. And they pushed them back. And in fact, they panicked, broke, and all of those folks that had brought picnic baskets and carriages out to enjoy a great sight ran back with them to Washington, D.C. Okay, so at the first of Battle of Bull Run, I think we better take a break.
That's so funny to think that
I know you've been curious about this quilt that is up here this morning, and I've asked Jean Libby to tell you about it. Gina.
The quilt was made by my great-grandmother while her husband, a colonel in the Army, was on Sherman's march to the sea. So I think it's about a little over 150 years old, but it's just interesting to see something that was made at that point of time, brings history more alive to us at this point in time.
Thank you very much, Jean. And now back to Jim Ahrens in Sherman.
Can you hear me okay? Make sure this thing still works. As long as everybody, if you can't hear me, make sure I know about it, because I can do things with this. Okay. Sherman himself participated in that Battle of Bull Run. He was cool under fire, and he received just slight wounds. But the Confederates turned that whole force back. After this, Sherman was sent next to Kentucky to help organize Union support out there in a border state. Remember, there are 3 border states that were very important, because that was where the Union had to hang on to and keep those under their control. Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And they become very active during the war. Well, he was at that place, first of all, got very much involved in preparations for, and he tried to make much more of the threat to Kentucky than other people thought was really necessary. He was very frustrated in the fact that there was nothing that he really could do, and he developed a serious depression. And it led to this first controversy with members of the press. They accused him of being crazy. And that led to his relief by Henry Halleck. Halleck was the commander of the Western Department. Excuse me, the press called him crazy, and he would hate reporters for the rest of his life. Now, there are people around today that have that same attitude. He would be forced, though, to deal with it, whether you liked him or not. And so Sherman's wife and the rest of the Ewing clan and John Sherman went to bat for him. And he was assigned back to Halleck in St. Louis. And Halleck found work for him. Gump was a natural logistic director. And he worked out of Paducah, Kentucky, supplying Grant and other forces that were operating in the area. The war began to take shape as the Union geared up for what I consider to be a serious picture. He didn't exactly take good pictures. He was a little rough around the edges when it came to uniforms and so forth. But after this, somebody had to defend him. And he did pretty well for defending himself by the war itself and his activities. US Grant was commanding the Department of Western Tennessee, and Sherman was part of that command. And he logistically supported Grant as he captured Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee. And then he commanded a division in the Battle of Shiloh. And that's the next one to look at in terms of little drawings. But this one's kind of important. Actually, that is a good battlefield to teach on, because it's fairly compact and you can see across both sides, front and back. And you can point out what you need to point out with the geography and so forth. And we used to take our students there, and we would bed down in National Guard armories in the local area, and did tours of Shiloh and Vicksburg. Very interesting. Students got along with it quite well. I remember, just as an aside, to waste a little time here, I took a group to look at Shiloh, the battlefield, and interestingly enough, it was raining like crazy that day, but we only had that day, so we put our ponchos on and walked around, and I ended up pushing one of the students who was lamed from a football accident, and he had to go in a wheelchair, which we borrowed while we were at the park. And so I ended up pushing and talking in his ear. The battle itself took place in early April of 1862. Not much happened except preparation and some battles in the far west. For example, the Battle of Lexington, Missouri, which I became intimately familiar with over years. And this one was where the campaigning is relevant to our subject took place. Sherman was commanding a division, and Sherman's division located here when the Confederate forces came marching out of the dawn darkness and surprised the Union forces there. They had neglected to entrench and put out enough defensive forces to be ready. Sherman's forces, along with the rest of them, were forced back in the early parts of the day, and the Confederates were aiming at driving them into the river here. Well, by 6 p.m., they had darn near done it. But Sherman organized his defenses, and he manages to set up a line, a defensive line here with most of the artillery, and the forces could be dug in at this point. And so Grant was sitting under a tree after dark that night, and he came up to Sherman came up to him and said, "Well, we had a tough day, didn't we?" And Grant says, "We'll lick them tomorrow." Well, they did. With Sherman's help and a lot of others who finally got all mobilized and ready to go, they pushed back the Confederate troops off towards Corinth and in northern Mississippi. And they won the Battle of Shiloh. And interestingly enough, it turned out to be a valiant defense that made the difference. Sherman was wounded twice and had 3 horses killed under him. And this time, Grant was the target of the press, who said he was drunk. Now, Henry Halleck succeeded Grant, and Sherman convinced Grant that he shouldn't give up and resign and quit his anticipated help. But Sherman's advice was taken, and Grant was reinstated to command and commanded here at Vicksburg. Now, brief word about the importance of Vicksburg. The Union strategy, which was called the Anaconda Plan by some enterprising journalists, was to surround the Confederacy both in a blockade around the ocean and on the river, and in the north with troops and military units. The key was the Mississippi River. Then, as now, almost all of the Midwest is using the Mississippi River. A lot of agricultural products go down that river for export and so on. Now, Vicksburg was right on the coast, right on the shore of the river. And what made this such a good fortification was this bend in the river. The river had to come around this horn, and cannon on these cliffs and shore would make a hash out of ships going up and down the river. And so that was the key. It had to be opened up. It had to be taken. And Sherman's forces, along with, and under Grant, were able to invest in surrounding. Now, they took out, as a very involved campaign that went on here, far beyond what we need to talk about this morning, but eventually, around the 4th of July, Sherman's forces and Grant's forces were able to overcome the resistance, and the besieged town of Vicksburg surrendered. And the Mississippi River was now open all the way to the sea. And that made essentially two countries out of the Confederacy. Those states west of the Mississippi versus those states east of it. And they were no longer mutually supporting. But the war still goes on for another couple of years. But anyway, that's the importance of that particular battle. And we're getting more and more serious. Sherman had a problem. Sherman's family came down from Ohio to visit him, and in an area, that son of his only son Willie, whom he put forward to following him in the army, died of typhoid. And they didn't get over that very long, for very much of a long time. After the death of him, his wife and other family members went back to Ohio. And Sherman was able to concentrate on planning what was going on next. And he and Grant took a trip to the east because Grant had been called by Lincoln to come over to the east and take over from McClellan and a series of other commanders who were nothing but duds. And he moves out, and two of them travel back along the Ohio River by rail, and they plan out what is going to happen with the conquest of Atlanta and the march to the sea. It was no spur-of-the-moment thing. When he got back from this, Sherman participated in several campaigns, and the most important one was this one, which showed his troops going over to Meridian, Mississippi, and he more or less figured out how they were going to, one, logistically support themselves. Because Napoleon's famous maxim about an army travels on its stomach is a long-time truism. And Sherman looked out a way from here. He could then cast off his logistics, and then on this trip to Meridian, which they used to destroy some valuable Confederate property there, as a learning experience. And he learned a great deal from it. He also learned that the Confederacy was a hollow shell in the South, the lower part of it, because most of their forces, what they had, were concentrated in the east and the northern part. And so he learned how they could supply themselves on the economy, on the people, and then he could then know how to destroy that war-making capability that they had in the South. The lesson was learned there. And they went on to other campaigns to the east. Sherman, a picture of Sherman on a horse overlooking Atlanta. Well, let's see if I catch up here with my notes. Sherman got, by the way, he got commissioned as a brigadier general in the regular army after the conquest of Vicksburg. And in the late summer, He was also successful in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and in that expedition to the Meridian, Mississippi area. Grant realized, and Sherman did too, that the war had to be ended as soon as possible. And in order to prevent him and others from being forced to kill their Southern friends and their estranged family members, because the Civil War divided families. Some supported the North, some supported the South. And the only place they met was on the battlefield in many cases. And it was something that he had to do in order to make this thing work. Both Grant and Sherman targeted the enemy forces, and not a particular geographic area. McClellan's major strategy was to take the capital of the South, Richmond, and the rest of it would crumble away. Didn't happen that way. Didn't happen to work out that way. In Sherman's campaigns in the West, which had been previously Grant's as well, they faced men like Joe Johnston, and they then were able to overcome them. Now, the Atlanta campaign was considerably important. One key thing, if you've ever flown into the South nowadays, you know where you go first? Atlanta. Virtually all of the airlines have huge hubs in Atlanta, and everybody gets a chance to go there. Well, the same thing was true with railroads in the early South, which had far fewer miles of track laid than before the Civil War than the North did. And then it all focused on Atlanta before it could be taken out, and it was a key hub. And so they had to take it. Going from Chattanooga in the north, Sherman launched his campaign to head for Atlanta. And one of the reasons why we use this slide here is to illustrate the maneuvering that had to be done. That's all you need to take away from that, because there had to be a lot of maneuvering to move forces that were opposing Sherman out of the way so that they could then be vested. And Sherman's whole idea was to, as much as possible, avoid casualties among his own troops, which should be a fairly obvious thing, but you'd be amazed at how many people were still locked into the old business of standing shoulder to shoulder in lines, marching and firing and so forth to kill their enemies. Now, I'll come back to this slide too several times, but we see how this thing works as we go through Tennessee and then through the area down here towards Atlanta. You notice these arrows here. Those arrows indicate Sherman's methodology. Where he would encounter with his forces a defensive line or a strong point, he would try, if at all possible, to move them out of position by flanking them, by going around the backside. And you have no, if you're flanked, you have no choice but to retreat or you're going to be cut off and surrounded. And so they took these forces led by Johnston and Hood. And by the way, here's some photographs. This is John Bell Hood, for whom Fort Hood is named today. Some people called him unbalanced. He had had an arm and a leg both removed on the same side. But he was a commander who followed much of the old school. And here's the senior commander of the Southern Forces after Lee. Lee took over from him after he was wounded in the battles in Virginia, real early in the war. But Johnston was always somebody they turned to because of his value. And so as they proceeded down the drive here, the only place where Sherman was to not follow his own advice was at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, which is located near Marietta, Georgia, on the north side of the Chattahoochee River. And today, one of the big things right below that is the air base and the huge plant built in World War II that proceeded to produce all kinds of aircraft, bombers primarily. And on Kennesaw Mountain, the Confederates were there. They were in position. They had fields of fire all mapped out, ready to decimate anybody who came their way. And Sherman, for some strange reason, abandoned his whole idea of flanking, and eventually he almost lost that particular battle because they were charging up hills into prepared positions, which is one of the more deadly things that you can do. Eventually, though, they overcome that, and they end up coming down here to take over Atlanta. Kennesaw Mountain was Sherman's really his bad day. The Confederates then will evacuate Atlanta. And the Union Army moved in September, and this eventually enabled Lincoln to win a second term in 1864 against McClellan, who ran as a civilian against Lincoln in that election. The votes from the victorious armies also helped too, because they did their best to canvass the army, and the Union Army was on a successful run of events, and so the people who were in that army voted very strongly for Lincoln. And so that made his second term a real possibility and a probability. Well, the next thing they did was to plan and get ready for moving off to the sea. Going through this stretch of territory across Georgia. That was something where they had to do. They were ready to jump off by December, and then they moved across the countryside. 50-mile wide columns covered 15 miles a day and encountered only minimal resistance from military forces. The rebels had little to resist with. They reached Savannah in early December and occupied the city and reestablished contact with the supplies that the blockading Navy had made stockpiles of for them. And most welcome commodity after having been marching for over a month, mail. Nobody knew, nobody had contact with them. Skype was not in existence. They were unable to get mail back and forth because Sherman, in his preparations, had sent back all his wounded and all his loafing, anybody who was not productive, back to the north. They had cut themselves off from the railroads, and they had destroyed them so that they couldn't be rebuilt right away. And the rest of the army moved by what they could take from the countryside and equipment that they could haul in their wagons. Just remember, they had to find food and forage. Huge numbers of horses were used in the Civil War. And so they had to supply these. And one way to do it was to take it from the countryside. Well, when they got there to Savannah, Lincoln received a telegram for Lincoln. Lincoln received a telegram from them offering Savannah to him as a Christmas present. And now Kump was a hero to the North. The praise that was just outrageous came from the press now. He was a hero. They forgot all about what they called him before. And so he sits there for a couple of months in Atlanta. And on 1 February, they start moving north. They headed out north on a fairly broad front from Savannah and up into South Carolina and then into North Carolina, bringing the same kind of tactics and the same kind of supplies to bear. During that break, Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, whom I think is one of the least savory characters of the whole Civil War, but they met together. Sherman was tasked to provide a plan of what to do with all of these freed slaves. They thought they were free. After all, Sherman had marched through and they followed the army. They had to eat too. So there was more and more destruction and decimation of southern resources to feed those freed slaves. What are you going to do with all of these? And that's what Stanton came down to do. He was a abolitionist of very important order. And Sherman came up with a plan, and Stanton approved it, was to give each freed slave, if they wanted it, a 40-acre plot of Sea Island land that had been abandoned by the Confederates in their conquered territory, perfectly consistent with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which had been issued in as effective 1 January 1863. So as a result of this, Kump's racist views were pretty much under pressure. He didn't have a lot of sympathy from Stanton. These are the people that made it all possible, Sherman's staff. And some of these people are familiar to us. You'll hear more about this fellow, John Logan, in the future. This is Oliver Howard, who eventually became head of the Freedmen's Bureau and eventually in the latter part of the 19th century founded Howard University in Washington, D.C. Prior to that time at Gettysburg, I have a connection with that. My great-grandfather was part of Howard's 11th Corps, and they were the ones who were routed by first Jackson's end run at Chancellorsville and then suffered very badly the get rid of some of this technology here. Come on, here we go. Anyway, Howard's 11th Corps, because they ran at that battle, were called Howard's Cowards. Later on, Howard would become an army commander under Sherman's forces, and he had lost an arm. You can see that there, and eventually will become a very well-known politician. But my great-grandfather was part of the 11th Corps, Howard's Cowards. as they were called. The staff made it all possible to get this all organized. Just keep Logan's in mind for just a little while longer. Okay, I've got to hurry up a little bit more as we see them jumping off north, heading north into some extremely bad weather starting in 1 February. The place was raining like crazy. There were floods all over the place. And Sherman and all the troops had to go through all of this. Not a whole lot of resistance. There was some from cavalry who were burning things that they thought maybe the Union forces could use ahead of them, and went to Columbia, South Carolina. Now, Columbia is the capital of the state that started this whole secession business, was regarded by all kinds of people as being, in the North, as being the seat of evil. And the Confederate cavalry had burned a whole bunch of bales of cotton, and that lint flew around, and eventually it burned about a third of that whole city. And as a result of that, Sherman was accused of a war crime when they worked all night trying to contain that fire, but it was not possible to prevent it from destroying much of that city. But in getting through all of this thing, Sherman traveled right along with everybody else. He slept under a tree with his cloak wrapped around him, just like all the rest of the troops did. And eventually moved up here into North Carolina, where they are going to reach Fayetteville on the 11th of March. There they got more mail. In Goldsboro on the 22nd of March, Sherman thought the campaign was over. And as a result of this, he got into negotiations with Johnston, who was commanding the residual forces up here in that area. Sherman and Grant met with Lincoln and Admiral David Porter, and they kept a record of the conversations. And as a result, the idea was to knit the country back together again as much as possible without the kind of bitterness that would lead to guerrilla warfare. And Sherman completely agreed and was happy that Lincoln's views matched his own, a hard war and a soft peace. Grant accepted Lee's surrender on April 9th. Terms were generous. The Army would disband in place, stack their arms. Officers could keep their sidearms and their personally owned horses, and they went home from that point. The simple formula worked there. Sherman knew that Lincoln was perfectly happy with that. And so he offered Johnston the same terms as Lee has accepted. And unfortunately, the Confederate Secretary of War was there, and they worked out a much more political settlement, which Lincoln resented. But Lincoln would have resented, but he was dead by this time. And Vice President Johnston was in command then. And this event precipitated a great split between Sherman and Stanton, the Secretary of War, because Andrew Johnson rejected Sherman's negotiations, and they made enemies out of him. Well beyond what President Johnson and the radical Republicans wanted to do, but it was very much in Lincoln's views, but Johnson did not want to accept this. In fact, Stanton had ordered Sherman to be fired and Grant to take over, and Grant ignored the orders and demonstrated, of course, that loyalty goes both ways between superior and subordinate. in my opinion, for what little it's worth, is that the killing of Lincoln was probably the greatest tragedy of the whole Civil War. It ended with a great parade, and the armies of the East and the armies of the West paraded. And they all stood on a reviewing stand there. Sherman refused to shake hands with Stanton as they greeted each other. And the armies went home after paying a tribute to Lincoln and Grant, and Stanton, of course, became an enemy for years. This is later on, and I'm hurrying right through this here, later on there will be an impeachment brought against John Johnson, the vice president, now president of the country, and it was not something that was very easily handled, and the impeachment did not pass. There were several people, a number of Republicans, who said they would vote against it, and did so, and he kept his job until the end of his term. But interestingly enough, Iowa Senator James W. Grimes was one of those Republicans who stood against impeachment and conviction. Sherman became General of the Army when Grant became president in 1869. Sherman was then to head the Army for a long time, up to 1884. He had put his son through law school and pressured him, and he was greatly disappointed when he became a Catholic Jesuit priest. He resented that for some reason. But Sherman will retire in 1884 and became a civilian, but he was an extremely busy civilian. He could do almost anything he wanted, so he kept up a huge correspondence during this time. And as a result of all of this, then the Army had to make peace with the Indians, or they had to conquer the Indians in the West. And Sherman, now as a retired individual, was able to indulge his gregarious nature. His wife had died in 1888 in the fall, and he went on by himself. He probably during this time overdid it a bit, and in 1891 he was averaging 4 public or private dinners a week, answering a huge number of letters, visiting with friends and family, going to the theater, and so forth. His asthma flared up from a cold and severe weakness, and caused him to die in the afternoon of 14 February 1891. There was a huge reception for the news. Sherman was taken to St. Louis eventually, and they had a long parade of train ride, and he's buried now in Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis. And these are his family grave site. And the epitaph, which he picked out for himself, faithful and honorable, which I think described Sherman to a T. And he became very famous, for example, when they issued commemorative stamps. But Sherman, Grant, and Sheridan on them, probably the most distinguished generation that fought the war. Yeah.
I just have a quick question. What was the difference in the ages between Sherman and Grant?
Not much.
Did they know each other at West
They
Point?
knew each other at the academy, and Grant was about 2 years younger. She's asking about the difference in ages between these. And Grant was famous at the academy for being a horseman. Yeah, Ken?
Sherman's greatest quote was when they were pushing him to be president, running for president, "If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve."
Perfectly consistent in my view of his whole attitude towards politicians in his whole life. Yeah, Eric?
Given that we are generally presented the image of Lee forbidding his men to loot, destroy terrain as he passed through, and sort of taking the high ground, the fact that Sherman allowed it to happen, apparently willy-nilly. You gave the example of Columbia, but perhaps the easiest way to ask the question is, was Sherman in fact a war criminal?
Well, he would have said no.
Because he was.
Naturally, when war occurs. But true, he targeted. But was he any more of a war criminal than Truman authorizing the first strike at Hiroshima? You know, you can ask that question almost endlessly nowadays. And there's much instructive reading about the Nuremberg trials and the trials that took place in Japan for people like Yamashita and Tojo and so forth. It's interesting. I know, it's an argument that goes on forever. Any other questions? I'm getting the wave off here. Okay.
It's kind of nice to hear someone who knows that much about what he's talking about. Very informative and entertaining, and thank you very much. And Flowers on Fourth, which is now Flowers by Design, was clever. They have a dove of peace in this flower arrangement. It may be pink, but it's a dove of peace. Thank you very much, Jen, for a wonderful hour and a half.
Thank you very much for this, and I will turn it over to the expertise of my botanist wife, who does know all about these sort of things.
Thank you, Nisha, and thank you, Jim. Next week, our class will be taught by John McIntyre, and the title is Wilma Mankiller. How can I forget that? Wilma Mankiller, who was the first female chief of the Cherokee Nation. So that's an area that we haven't explored, and I think you'll enjoy it. In the meantime, tomorrow night, right here, 7 o'clock, Caleb Elfenbein will be doing the 100 years of change, World War I to modern or the contemporary Middle East. And remember, Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock at Sebring Lewis, you have the flyer from Eric McIntyre for the concert there. And after that, we'll see you here next Wednesday morning. Thank you for coming.